The story is told that Abraham Lincoln, once dealing with a cantankerous committee, asked them, how many legs would a sheep have if you called its tail a leg? The committee deliberated and then finally answered, 5. No, responded Lincoln, because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it one. That committee is a proper symbol for our age, it seems to me. We live in an age when if you call it a leg and say it long enough, then everyone will agree that a tail is indeed a leg, especially if you say it on TV. We make it up as we go along, we who live in this age, as if we were the very first generation to have lived upon the face of the earth. We don't trust the old rules, the old conclusions, certainly not the old institutions. We must make up the rules as we go, deciding what is right and wrong on the basis of the moment, on the basis of our contemporary assessment of what feels right to me. So we simply blow with the wind. We have the morality of a windsock, forever changing directions. We have alt facts and fake news, and truth seems permanently up for grabs by those with the grubbiest hands and loudest voices. We feel unanchored, morally adrift, and so we'll hitch a ride on the latest opinion most strongly expressed. That's the context, it seems to me, in which we consider this morning's question of faith. What biblical rules shall we follow? We live in a culture that seems to believe we shouldn't have any rules at all. Journalist Ted Koppel gave a commencement address at Duke University several years back, and after doing what I just did, which is bemoaning the current state of the nation, Koppel asked rhetorically, now what is the answer to that which ails us? Then he proceeded to go through the 10 Commandments, telling the graduates that these are the 10 Commandments, not the 10 suggestions. What do you think? Is Ted Koppel right? Do we need to once again find our moral anchoring in the law, in the 10 Commandments? Here's my honest answer. Yes. Yes. I also believe that we have a deep-seated suspicion concerning the 10 Commandments. We fear that the 10 Commandments are some kind of impersonal, external, arbitrary series of laws imposed on us by an unyielding, angry parent God. Listen, we're Americans, so we don't like to be told what to do. For us, almost by definition, laws are an unfair restriction of our individual prerogative, a hedge on what we feel is our God-given right to do as we darn well please. And here in this church, we're members of the United Church of Christ, where the most cherished rule from the Robert's Rules of Order is the motion to suspend the rules. It's from that kind of liberty-loving, law-skeptical attitude that we tend to view the 10 Commandments. But let me tease out what the Bible means by law. You know that the 10 Commandments, or Decalogue, forms the core of Torah in the Old Testament. We usually define Torah as law, and it is that. But for Israel, Torah was not so much the rules that were to be followed as the way that was to be walked. Torah is probably better translated as the way, or more literally from the Hebrew, the finger pointing the way. Torah does not necessarily tell us each and every step in life, but it is a reliable guide from God, pointing us in the right direction. So, what does that mean for how we should understand biblical law? Well, let me ask, should we not steal simply because we are told not to? Or should we not steal because respect for personal property is simply the way that a loving community needs to be organized? Should we not kill simply because the 10 Commandments tell us not to? Or is respect for life the way, in fact, the only way that we can live together? In the book of Exodus to the 10 Commandments, the architect of the universe takes a moment to explain to the newest residents of this universe the way it was put together, the way it works best. And if those folks were paying attention, they found out something amazing, that God's way was all-encompassing, involving not just worship, but our work life. Don't work 7 days a week. Take a break, a Sabbath rest. It involved us in the public sphere. Don't lie in a public proceeding. And in the private sphere, look after your parents. It involved our sex life. Be faithful. And our innermost thoughts. Don't lust after somebody else's new car or huge house or trophy husband. The 10 Commandments told them that God was to be found and heard and received as a loving guide everywhere throughout our lives. So the 10 Commandments, the heart of the law in the Bible, are not some arbitrary list of do's and don'ts imposed on us by God. Instead, they are a straightforward description of the way we can live together as human beings. As G.K. Chesterton is once reported to have said, if a person comes to the edge of a cliff and keeps on walking, he will not break the law of gravity, he will prove it. That's, it seems to me, is what is happening in our country today. By breaking the old established codes of civility and civilized behavior, we're proving how essential it is to our relationships with one another. We are not simply breaking the law. We are violating the way. So, there's my pitch for the 10 Commandments as a way of understanding biblical law, not as arbitrary rules, but as a way to just and fruitful living. If the question is, what biblical rules should we follow? My answer is the way. The way. The way pointed to and articulated by the 10 Commandments. And here's the reasonable follow-up question. What would Jesus make of my answer? Summer isn't a bad time to remind you that whenever your preacher starts talking about what Jesus would think, he or she should be holding up a sign that reads in large, clear letters, "It seems to me." So full disclosure, I don't know what Jesus would make of my answer, but it seems to me that a good place to look would be to where Jesus is asked this question of faith, or a very near corollary to it. In the 22nd chapter of Matthew, Jesus is asked, which commandment is the greatest? Do you remember that? It seems to me that's the question that we're dealing with. Jesus answers by combining the Shema from Deuteronomy with a verse of moral instruction from Leviticus, and he joins them together under the common theme of love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, Jesus answers. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. For Jesus, clearly, the way is the way of love. A love that inhabits and directs your relationships with God, self, and neighbor. But let's also acknowledge something else about Jesus' relationship with the law. There are times when he seems like a great defender of religious law and religious tradition, and times when he seems like its greatest challenger, a rebel, a religious revolutionary. It's hard to hold these two aspects of Jesus' relationship with the law together. But you know that with a mature faith comes the ability to embrace paradox. You know what a paradox is? When the path to wisdom comes from embracing two seemingly contradictory thoughts. Here's a common, very important paradox. People are basically good, and people are essentially bad. We might answer either one of those ways, depending on who we're with, the mood that we're in at the time, how recently we watched the national news. But the paradoxical wisdom that we all need to embrace sooner or later is that people are a mixture of good and bad. That's paradox, right? That's wisdom of paradox. When it comes to the law, Jesus offers us a similarly head-spinning paradox. While proclaiming in our first passage this morning that he doesn't seek to change or dishonor one letter or one stroke of the law, we also witness his behavior. In Matthew 12, he and his disciples pluck heads of grain and eat them on the Sabbath, in clear violation of the plain meaning of the Sabbath laws. In multiple places, Jesus heals on the Sabbath, arguing that, of course, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He habitually eats with sinners. He teaches women. He doesn't practice ritual cleansing in 100 different ways. He upsets the literal and narrow-minded keepers of the religious laws and ordinances. And ultimately, Jesus is tried in a religious court as a blasphemer and lawbreaker and condemned as such. So which is it? Does Jesus believe that we should assiduously follow the law, or does Jesus think that laws are irrelevant and need to give way to deeper principles and more enduring values? The most accurate answer is yes. Embracing the paradox posed by Jesus' teaching and behavior. Well, I started this reflection in despair over the current state of our national moral life, and one of the antidotes for despair for me comes from inspirational examples. When I get to witness in others their imitation of Christ. So here's a true story that I come back to again and again. I'll call up on YouTube when I'm feeling low and I need to feel some optimism about the human enterprise once again. Coming back to it recently, in light of our thoughts about law, it provided me with some new insight. You may remember the story of Sarah Tucholsky of Western Oregon women's college softball team. She came up to bat against Central Washington. For the first time in her life, not just in her college career, but for the first time in her life, she hit a home run. And Sarah, just as she touched and rounded first base, something terrible happened. She tore a ligament in her knee and collapsed. She was unable to go any further. Lay there on the ground. And as she writhed there on the ground, the team's coach, the trainer rushed in. The umpire came up and reminded the teams of the rules. If her teammates or coaches assist her in rounding the bases, she will be declared out. And if a pinch runner is substituted for her, her home run will be erased and declared simply a single. Upon hearing this, and without hesitation, Central Washington's Mallory Holtman and Liz Wallace, two opposing players, picked Sarah up and carried her around the bases. They stopped over second base so Sarah could touch it with her good leg, then over third, and then all the way home where, after she completed her journey, she was gently transferred into the arms of her teammates. I would imagine that many of us would have faulted the umpire for his strict adherence to the rules of softball. Surely this would have been a good occasion to move to suspend the rules. On the other hand, adhering to the rules forced the teams to come up with a different and creative solution, one that got them, it seems to me, to the heart of team sports, mutual respect and sportsmanship. And of course, it provided me and all of us with an abiding example of the way of love found at the heart of God's hopes for us all. The way of love, recommended by Jesus, can guide us on our journey as individuals, as people of faith, and as a nation. It can guide us and bring us all the way back home. Amen.